Tally-ho, hip-hip, and welcome to the second episode of the History Odyssey podcast. I'm your host, Steve, and settle down, for we shall be discussing a matter of the utmost volatility. Now, if you've been following the news at all, specifically the non-COVID news, which there has been an abundance of, so that's a good liberation from COVID, but now we have a bloody war going on. Now, in history class, we often learn about a lot of wars. Human history is filled with wars. In Vietnam, our history is basically mostly war. The most recent one being the border war with the People's Republic of China, the Vietnam War against the United States. Earlier even, we had a war with France, the Indochina Wars, with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and other wars with invading Chinese dynasties throughout our history. And with regards to global history, we've all learnt about the two world wars, the Blitzkrieg over Poland and France. In such a swift manner, the German army captured those two nations. But in the end, it was no preparation at all to actually witness a war in our lifetime, to see history unfold before your eyes. What is happening right now between Russia and Ukraine will be learnt by our grandchildren and children in the future, in their history books. So it is quite a peculiar feeling to see history unfolding before our very eyes in such a swift manner. At the time I wrote this script, I was going to use the Russo-Ukrainian diplomatic tensions going. At the time it was still diplomatic tensions. You know how swift things have passed. But obviously now things have escalated beyond a simple recognition of independence of the separatist republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, and all-out invasion has occurred. It's only been 2 days and the Russian military is already on the doorsteps of the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. So first of all, I would like to send my best regards of peace to the Ukrainian civilians who are obviously innocent in this conflict and do not deserve the suffering that is being inflicted upon them by this conflict, and I hope that the whole affair ends with not too many casualties on either side and we can get on with it and return to peace. So anyhow, that was a rather heavy start to today's podcast. So you might be wondering though, what is the cause of this conflict? The Russo-Ukrainian tensions isn't a novel thing at all. It has been going on since the annexation of Crimea and arguably since the dissolution of the Soviet Union back in 1991. So what has been causing this? Obviously, with all global conflicts occurring now and throughout human history, there are many geopolitical factors involved. But one striking factor I noticed that is shared by both sides, both sides are guilty of this, is nationalism, and that is also the topic we shall be discussing today, also via Yuval Noah Harari's book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, what he has got to see about it. And in the end we'll perhaps know more about nationalism, one of the contributing factors at play here in this modern conflict. So yes, let's learn about nationalism, specifically nationalism, patriotism in the 21st century and its implications, which we can obviously see right now going on between Russia and Ukraine, and in many other instances often not gloated over. So let's learn about nationalism. First of all, before we actually get into the concept and history of the ideology of nationalism, let us make clear the distinction between patriotism and nationalism. While both derive from the unique human ability as social animals to develop cultures and intimate communities around which we gather, which would later develop into concepts such as the nation-state, which is the dominant political entity nowadays. We have 195 nations around the world and many other unrecognised nations or non-UN member states such as Somaliland or Kosovo or Northern Cyprus, etc. It is the dominant political entity nowadays in the 21st century. Or we also have other forms of social organisation such as tribes, which still exist in certain parts of the world. City-states, if you remember your history lessons about ancient Greece, you would remember Athens and Sparta, and in Italy there was Rome. And empires, the city-state of Rome in Italy would turn into the Roman Empire, and we would remember the British Empire, which dominated around a quarter of the globe. And we arguably still have today, but they are more subtle and diplomatic as opposed to the violent colonizing and conquering empires of the old. Some still refer to the United States as the American Empire, or China as a new Chinese Empire, etc. Or perhaps there are even smaller entities around which humans gather, such as churches or corporations, and perhaps in the future, with the climax of globalism, the Earth might unite into a global union, given that it develops strong cultural foundations. Anyhow, let's now actually get to the distinction between the two concepts of nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism, in the simplest sense of the word, means love of one's country or homeland. The word itself comes from the Greek patriotes, which means fellow countrymen. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy offers a more detailed description of patriotism as follows. Number 1, special affection for one's own country. Number 2, a sense of personal identification with the country. Number 3, a special concern for the well-being of the country. And number 4, willingness to sacrifice to promote the country's good. To give you some examples, I'll quote one of the beginning lines on the chapter of nationalism in Harari's book, where he also defines patriotism through various examples. For example, a good patriot pays his taxes honestly, so that means he cannot treat his own kids in an expensive private hospital, but unknown children on the other side of the country will get good national health care. Similarly, a patriotic official gives lucrative jobs to the most qualified applicants rather than to his own brothers and cousins. It is quite the fascinating human phenomenon, isn't it? Patriotism is sort of selfless in a way, to care about people whom, let's be honest, you don't know much about at all except for the essential information that they're your compatriot. Dare I ask you, can you name the 90 million Vietnamese people whom you consider your compatriot? I don't think so, but you still care about them, do you? Do you? Because that's part of patriotism. Moving on, with nationalism, things get rather complicated. Again, in the most basic sense of the word, nationalism is based on the premise that an individual's loyalty and devotion to the nation-state surpasses other individuals' or group interest. Initially, nationalism and patriotism were actually interchangeable words. It is interesting to note that the latter, patriotism, is a much older word than nationalism, the former, apparently, according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, 150 years older. However, as time passes, nationalism began to develop a more negative connotation. Not only does it entail love and devotion to one's nation, which is right there in the word nationalism, but also a belief in the supremacy, priority, or superiority of one's nation over other nations. More extreme iterations of nationalism include chauvinism, ultranationalism, or ethno-nationalism, which also has the added baggage of ethnicity along with loyalty to the nation. And this subject, again, I shall note, is very much under heavy debate, but for simplicity's sake, we shall distinguish between nationalism and patriotism over the fact that nationalism emphasises a belief in the superiority of one's nation. Of course, you may make your objections down in the comment section if you disagree. A further disclaimer, nationalism and patriotism doesn't necessarily inherently fit into any political categorizations such as right-wing or left-wing. There exist brands of nationalism and patriotism on both sides of the political spectrum. There are conservative nationalists and socialist nationalists, left-wing nationalists and right-wing nationalists equally. Finally, although nationalism has become quite the negative word as of late, it isn't limited to African militia groups or American skinheads and white supremacists. In fact, most successful nations in the world, Germany, Switzerland, and the United States, practice soft forms of nationalism. Nationalism in its soft form, which may be conflated with patriotism, but that's a debate we're not getting into right now, create national bonds within a nation. Nations with weak nationalism, such as Yugoslavia, or the former Soviet Union, or many countries in Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Somalia, they're all falling apart, while successful nations such as Germany, Switzerland, the United States, they have a strong national bond, and as such, they practice a soft form of strong nationalism. After all, I challenge you to name a nation that is selfless and doesn't care about itself over all else. But of course, there is a distinction between nowadays' quote-unquote nationalist Germany and Nazi Germany, which is also nationalist but practices a very extreme form of nationalism. Now, moving on, let us talk about the history of this particular ideology. Most of the philosophical concepts, it is nigh impossible to pin down the birth date of nationalism. It isn't attributed to one particular Greek philosopher or Roman philosopher. One could make the argument that since the times of cavemen, there have existed tribes who absolutely hated each other's guts and believed in their primacy. This is a primitive form of nationalism known as tribalism, and still exists to this day in peoples who still practice tribal organizations. Perhaps it is possible to say that nationalism was birthed alongside with selfishness or egotism, the belief that one's community or oneself is the most important. However, we're not getting into that particular philosophical conversation for today. The general consensus is that nationalism was firmly established in the 19th century with the rise of popular sovereignty, exemplified by the American Declaration of Independence and the French Revolution. Now, what did nationalism replace, particularly? Many refer to the 19th century as the age of nationalism, but obviously people need to have something to unite around in the past. Well, in the past, it was mostly monarchism, loyalty to the monarchy, since most nations practiced a monarchical form of government, loyalty to the king, to the queen, to the duke, to the prince. It's obviously an early form of nationalism to the country. Now, in Britain, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, people began to identify with an integrated, nation-encompassing economy and a national public sphere. These are all prerequisites for nationalism in a nation. It is at this time that we see in Britain that national symbols began to develop. The Union Jack, the current flag of the UK we see now, was officially adopted in 1801. The patriotic song Rule Britannia was composed in 1740, and if you're a fan of propaganda, John Bull, who became the personification for Great Britain, was invented in 1712. Other parts of the world were also significantly affected by nationalism during this time. France, as I've mentioned before, by the French Revolution, which overthrew the French monarchy and replaced loyalty to the monarchy with loyalty to the French nation and people. As we see many titles later on, many titles later on, Napoleon, who would later come into power, would crown himself not as Emperor of France, but Emperor of the French. And it is also in France that we see the birth of revanchism and irredentism, which is territorial expansionist nationalism, the belief that there is a greater iteration of your nation. With regards to France, it was expansion into German territories of Alsace-Lorraine and into the Rhineland during the Napoleonic era, or perhaps later on in Germany it would be expansion for Lebensraum, living space for the Germanic people. Or perhaps moving to Vietnam, there's also Vietnamese irredentism. Don't think that we're not guilty from nationalism. Back during the Nguyen dynasty, we controlled large swaths of Laos and Cambodia, so that's an iteration of Vietnamese irredentism. Now, there are also other expressions of the rise of nationalism during this time, namely the most notable ones were German and Italian unifications. Now, for centuries, Germany and Italy weren't a concept at all. There wasn't a political entity known as Germany or Italy. There were many independent, small German and Italian nations. In Italy, you might have heard of the Republic of Venice, the Papal States, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. In Germany, you may have heard of Prussia or Bavaria or Austria. There wasn't really a concept for a German or Italian nation, But as a result of nationalism, we see these nations unify. Germany in 1871, when they waltzed into Paris and crowned Kaiser Wilhelm I, who was before that King Wilhelm I of Prussia, into Kaiser Wilhelm I of the German Empire. And in Italy, you see the Risorgimento with Giuseppe Garibaldi and the reunification efforts by the Kingdom of Sardinia, Piedmont. So those were the most prominent expressions of the rise of nationalism during this time. Russia, the nation we mentioned at the beginning of the video, actually developed, at the beginning of the podcast, actually developed its nationalism from a rather strange source. It developed it from monarchism itself. It developed its nationalism from loyal obedience to the Tsar, or the Emperor of Russia, with the motto orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. And as evidenced by this motto, it was also religious in nature, focused on the defense of the Orthodox Christian faith, which was the dominant faith in Russia and often known as a centerpiece of Russian identity. Later on, Russia would give birth to Pan-Slavism, a belief in the preservation of the Slavic peoples, such as ergo Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians, which is especially topical nowadays, Czechs, Polish, the other West Slavic groups, or Serbians and Croats, etc. Specifically with regards to the current events taking place in Ukraine now, you might know that there exists a sizable Russian minority in eastern Ukraine, sometimes referred to as Novorossiya, New Russia, and from there the Luhansk and Donetsk republics were formed. Russia used the ethnic majority in Crimea. Remember, in Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula was majority Russian before its annexation, as a casus belli, a justification for the annexation of Crimea, and it is also citing the supposed genocide of Russian minorities in Ukraine as a justification to invade the country. And Putin, during his speech, used a lot of history, saying that Ukrainians and Russians were one people. This is also a form of Pan-Slavism. We're seeing it expressed right now. In fact, the nationalism of Russia right now is much closer to the nationalism of the Russian Empire than the later nationalism of the Soviet Union. But we won't get too deep into that topic now. Now, we've been talking a lot about Europe. What about nationalism in the rest of the world? Well, as I've said before, the United States was formed as a byproduct of the rise of nationalism in the 17th and 18th century, and 18th century, the American Declaration of Independence. We also saw the rise of nationalism in Latin America with the breakaway of all the Spanish colonies of Mexico and Venezuela, Gran Colombia, Brazil, Argentina, Peru. They were all results of nationalist rebellions against the Spanish crown. And going all the way to the east in Vietnam, our independence from France was characterized as a nationalist rebellion, though we were certainly not trying to expand our nations in Laos and Cambodia, but our independence wars, along with all of the independence wars occurring in Asia and in Africa during the decolonization period against the European empires, were characterized by nationalist struggles for independence, during which Vietnam was a part of. And Vietnamese nationalism in particular, Vietnam has a strong history of this ideology. It's mostly focused on our military successes against our invaders throughout our history. History has not been very kind to us with regards to wars. We've fought against many invaders, most of them against China, from the defensive wars against the Chinese dynasties up to the 20th century, with the infamous Indochina wars involving France and the United States, and a border conflict just recently in the 90s against the People's Republic of China. Our nationalism is focused mostly on a sense of contempt for China, often considered Vietnam's historical nemesis, who still threatens our nation to this day. Just look at the Nine Dash Line and the Spratly and Paracel Islands in the Eastern Sea. Anyhow, furthermore, now this is a particularly important part, nationalism was responsible for two of the greatest conflicts in human history. The rise of nationalism in the Balkans gave rise to Serbian, Bulgarian, Montenegrin, Greek nationalism, which brought the downfall of the Ottoman Turk Empire in the Balkans, And one specific Serbo-Bosnian nationalist in Sarajevo decided to assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary to protest against the nation's occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina and other Slavic territories in the Balkans in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This caused World War I, the Great War. After World War I, many nations experienced a surge in nationalism. In Germany, obviously, they were the losers of the First World War, so they were very bitter against because of the loss of territory to the new nations of Poland, the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to France, and Italy, despite being the winner of World War I, did not get their demands. They did not get the territories which they desire, the territories of Dalmatia from Yugoslavia, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they were also very bitter, and thus we saw the rise of fascism. And in Germany, German ultranationalism, known as National Socialism, and fueled by the charisma of Adolf Hitler. In Italy, it was the charisma of Benito Mussolini, and from there they formed the Axis along with Japan, an empire in the East who also felt very bitter about the First World War, with an incensed sense of nationalism and national pride and regret and contempt against the Western powers. They also experienced a surge in nationalism in Japan and thus formed the Axis powers, and that was World War II. Now, after World War II, nationalism continued to rise. Later conflicts after World War II, as I've said, the decolonisation period in Asia and Africa, were all nationalistic in nature. The Vietnamese rebels who fought against France were characterised as Vietnamese nationalist. Later on, in the 90s, we saw bloody conflicts in the aftermath of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, as all the independent nations, Croatia, Serbia, fought together in Bosnia to fight for their respective ethnic groups. And it was filled with despicable war crimes, ethnic cleansings and civilian casualties. The biggest of them all, as of late, were the conflicts which erupted after the fall of the Soviet Union. And the current tensions between Russia and Ukraine right now is a byproduct of that collapse of such a big nation. The war happening right now it is an official war yet, but it might as well be considered a war between Russia and Ukraine, are a direct result of the collapse of the Soviet Union and a rise in nationalism amongst the former Soviet republics. Russian nationalism we have already discussed. It's pretty evident that that was the main cause of this conflict. They wanted to get the territories of Novorossiya in Donbass and the Lugansk and Donetsk republics, as well as the southern regions of Ukraine, characterized under the umbrella term of Novorossiya. But Ukrainian nationalism also caused this conflict as well. After the Euromaidan protest, the Revolution of Dignity, it was called in Ukraine, there was an upsurge in Ukrainian nationalism and historical revisionism, Russophobic historical revisionism, as many people started to revere Nazi collaborationist Stepan Bandera, the former anarchist leader Nestor Makhno. And that was also a justification that Vladimir Putin used in his speech. And while I don't think that justifies the conflict in any way, it is important to note that both sides are guilty of nationalism with regards to this conflict. So now, there we go, we have a brief history of nationalism. Now let's get to its status at the moment and its potential implications in the future. Moving on to the present state of nationalism. Now, if you've been following the news recently, then I'm not talking about the tensions between Ukraine and Russia, though that does count too. Actually, I'm talking about since 2016, and that's been 6 years ago. Bloody hell, mate. Time flies, doesn't it? Anyhow, from that period until now, nationalism has been on the rise as a result of a massive backlash against the supposedly degenerate dominant culture of cosmopolitanism, globalism, and their apparent failure to deliver their promises and solve the issues of our time through the immigration crisis in the United States and in Europe, and economic downturn in many of those countries. And we see the greatest indication of this rise of neo-nationalism and neo-conservatism, though, again, right-wing politics and nationalism aren't inherently linked, though in this instance they are. The rise of Donald Trump, his surprise win in the 2016 election, 306 electoral votes to Hillary's 232 electoral votes, shocked everyone, and nobody thought he would actually win, but that showed the backlash against the globalist order of our time. Donald Trump, throughout his 4 years, was perhaps one of America's most right-wing presidents since Ronald Reagan. We also saw Brexit occurring in Britain. The referendum occurred in 2016, but the results and consequences of that vote, in which Britain voted 51% to about 48% to leave the European Union, is still affecting us to this day. We have a staunch Brexit Conservative government in the United Kingdom. After Brexit, Britain lost its Prime Minister in the form of David Cameron. Then we have two Prime Ministers in the interval trying to negotiate a successful Brexit. Theresa May went out, and for now, Boris Johnson's still in power in a staunchly conservative, pro-Brexit and right-wing government in the United Kingdom. We also saw the rise of nationalism in other countries around the world. In Europe, we have the rise of Marine Le Pen, who was, unlike most other populist candidates at the time, beaten by a moderate in Emmanuel Macron. We had the rise of the AfD, Alternative for Germany, and far-right party in Germany, the victory of Sebastian Kurz's Freedom on Free Party of Austria. In Austria, the rise of the Five Star Movement in Italy. I could go on and on. It seems that nationalism is becoming a popular alternative to the liberal globalist order of our time. And they have this sort of fantastical dream, as I shall quote from Harari's book, of a nationalist internationale, with isolationism as the global order, resulting in a network of secure and isolated fortresses around the world, and somehow nations will just go with it and focus inwards on themselves in a sort of nationalist global harmony. Now, that idea, in and of itself, without going too deep, is incredibly ludicrous if one has a basic understanding of geopolitics. No nation is going to be isolationist without a desire for expansionism. Nationalism and expansionism tend to go hand in hand. Isolationist nationalism does exist. I do not deny this. President Trump's nationalism is a sort of isolationism, with him withdrawing from military conflicts around the world, in Afghanistan and Syria. And many nationalist movements in the world are isolationist in nature. But the idea of nationalism is the emphasis on the primacy of the nation. We would want the best for our nation. And sometimes that best thing for our nation is to get more territory, as is going on in Russia, as is going on in China and India and Pakistan. That is expansionist nationalism. So this sort of dream of a harmonious nationalist internationale with isolationism as the motto and the idea is just impossible. It's fantastical, as I've said before. This network of supposedly isolationist fortresses, all respecting of their individual cultures, is simply impossible to do. Now, but also nationalism is actually a dangerous thing to the globalist order we have set up after the Second World War. One of the things that has been responsible for the lack of a Third World War recently is known as the nuclear deterrent. Now, since many nations in the world possess nuclear weapons, namely the United States, Russia, China, India, France, the United Kingdom, etc., war has become more and more an unattractive manner, even though there's a war going on right now, but it's not between two nuclear powers. War between two nuclear powers could result in what they would call MAD, which is an acronym for Mutually Assured Destruction, since both nations can launch nukes and totally destroy each other, resulting in no victory at all. Now, this system of nuclear deterrence and a lack of a global conflict can only be sustained with international cooperation and agreement, and indeed that requires an international order even though you may rail against the uselessness of the UN, it has been this sort of facade of international legitimacy and international order to prevent a nuclear Armageddon. So a nationalist international, already itself an impossible concept, would inevitably break down this volatile status quo. If we were to return to the times when nations cared only about themselves, that time could have worked. It has worked in the 19th century, but that was before the advent of the nuclear bomb as a viable weapon of war. So with this nationalist international, again, I believe it is impossible, and I don't think it'll ever come about, or any nation or an implementation would be attempted. But if it were to happen, then no, there won't be harmonious nationalist nations around the world enjoying peace and prosperity. Nuclear Armageddon would come to fruition because MAD would be completely disregarded. Imagine a nationalist China and a nationalist United States. They wouldn't care about nuclear destruction. They would care about destroying the other nation, and the other nation would care about destroying their other enemy. So that would just completely destroy the international system of checks and balances we have for MAD and the nuclear deterrence. Also, an important point to note is that although nationalism is becoming an incredibly attractive ideology as a sort of solution to our problems, if we were to look at the major problems of our time, the ecological collapse, and the ecological collapse and the technological collapse, nationalism simply provides no answer to any of those problems. Instead, it focuses on short-term and very attractive sound bites and debatable issues such as multiculturalism, globalism, and immigration. But what answer does nationalism have for the environment? None at all. I haven't seen a green nationalist. I know they might exist somewhere, but a green nationalist has not been seen at all, and and the ecological problem is shared by the entire world. You can't just solve it in the United States, in Austria, in Italy. It won't go away. It is a worldwide, a global problem, and that is the antithesis of nationalism. Nationalism is against a global cooperation, and an ecological collapse requires global cooperation to rectify the issue. And also with regards to technological development. Now, we are very concerned about a potential biotech collapse when AI becomes ASI, artificial superintelligence, and many of our technological capabilities expand beyond our control. It is simply impossible to rectify any of these issues if we were to enter a state of international isolationism, as the Nationalist International would propose. We can't possibly control. It's already hard to control now what scientists in China are doing and what scientists in the United States are doing, or already disparate attempts at developing AI and technology. With the Nationalist International, there would be absolutely no regard for ethical and sustainable technological development, and nations would just go on their way, and this would lead to absolute chaos with regards to the technological field. So, yes, nationalism, it is an attractive solution. I can see the merits of why someone would propose nationalism as a solution to our current problems. But in the end, looking at the greatest problems of our time, perhaps nationalism may have been a solution in the 18th century. It helped unite nations. It helped create national bonds for very disunited and divided nations. But later on, it caused 2 world wars in the 20th century, and now it is surging in the polls in many nations, many nationalist candidates and right-wing nationalist candidates, and for now are rising in the polls in many nations. But quite simply, it has no solution to all of our problems, which are global in nature, and that is antithetical to what nationalism proposes for a global nationalist order. So therefore, nationalism, it is an attractive solution, but it is not a viable solution to our problems. United we stand, divided we fall, is the motto in this situation. All of these issues taken into account, notwithstanding nationalism's temporary boost in popularity, I can come to the conclusion alongside the point made by Yuval Noah Harari mentioned above in his book 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Nationalism doesn't really possess a legitimate place in the 21st century as a solution to our global problems. It may have worked to unify the divided nations and peoples of Italy and Germany back in the 19th century, helped establish the independence of colonised peoples in Africa, Latin America and Asia in the 18th and 20th centuries. Then again, it also contributed to the two bloodiest wars in human history, the two world wars and the collapse of the Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, the latter of which still affects us to this day in the form of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict going on right now. Most importantly, nationalism doesn't offer any concrete or legitimate answers to any of the challenges of the 21st century. It's not going to curb climate change, it's not going to prevent the biotech disaster. In fact, it would only exacerbate these problems by pulling nations apart and replacing globalism, the order which currently somewhat unites the nations of the world, with bickering tribalism. And we all know that humanity can't afford to return to this world order in view of the presence of nuclear weapons, thus MAD, mad, mutually assured destruction. Though I must say, that nationalism isn't entirely a despicable or contemptuous ideology. Every nation requires nationalism in order to be a nation. Nationalism, the belief and loyalty and devotion to one's nation. Although that may be in a mild form of patriotism, nationalism is a requirement in a nation, notwithstanding all of its deficiencies and all of the negative connotations it has right now. Most successful nations in the world practice soft forms of nationalism which unite their nation and put their national interest first and foremost. So whilst I do not believe that nationalism has a place as the domineering ideology of our time, I do not think that it has no place at all in the 21st century, and it is still necessary for the development of individual and separate nations of the world if we're not going to unite into a global union, which I personally do not advocate for or believe in. To conclude, while this is a heavily controversial issue, I believe we can all agree that nationalism may play a good part, a positive part in our day and age, although it is not the solution to our problems. As we can see now, it has many dark sides, evidenced by the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We are seeing many deaths in that conflict already. In only 2 days, loads of developments have occurred, and the capital of Kiev might have already fallen by the time this podcast gets posted. Hopefully on a Sunday, and during this week, the conflict may have already ended, and I sure hope it ends in any way possible as long as not many casualties occur. And my best wishes are sent to the Ukrainian civilians, soldiers, and Russian soldiers and civilians on both sides. Let us not prolong this suffering any longer, and may peace be given a chance in these volatile and historical times. Thank you for tuning in to the History Odyssey podcast. This was a rather heavy podcast with a controversial topic. It was controversial enough without the current conflict occurring in Ukraine right now, but it has created a heavier tone to this podcast. I hope you have learned more about the conflict, which is being motivated by nationalism, a negative side of nationalism, and on both sides of the conflict. And hopefully you may have learned that nationalism does have a good place in our society. So thank you for tuning in to this episode of the History Odyssey podcast. I am Steve, signing off.